Bullshit.
Pretend for a moment we've entered a parallel universe free of bullshit and full of bold solutions. That's what the No BS Marketing Show is all about. I'm your host, Dave Mastovich. Our guest today is Chef Bill Fuller. But first, let's cut the bullshit. When someone asks you what a friend or coworker does, what do you say? Oh, she's in sales. He's an accountant. He does the billing. If someone from another department sticks their nose in on one of your projects, do you think, what does he know? He's a insert label. Why do we try to put everyone else in a box? Equally important, why do we let others box us in? When I'm doing the No BS marketing workshop for companies or speaking to college students or other groups, I often talk about how the unboxable types seem to be the happiest and most successful people I know, and Chef Bill is one of those. They do their thing, actually things, well, and enjoy doing it. They don't allow others to limit or label them. Their strategy works because they and pretty much everyone else are more complex than one label from work. You might be a son or daughter, friend, team member, leader, parent, volunteer, etc. Yet in the workplace, we're supposed to stay in our own little box. Worse yet, some people wouldn't want to venture outside of their box, even if they could. If you're one of those bosses or coworkers putting labels on others, you're missing out on some of the resources, free resources, available to you. Ask for input and actively listen to the responses. You'll benefit from both the good ideas and the goodwill created. For those who've been afraid or reluctant to step out of their comfort zone, take a chance. You're not just in PR, customer service, or billing. You have a unique perspective that can benefit your company. Communicate with peers, bosses, customers, and vendors. Make them aware of the ideas you have to improve your company's products, services, and processes. When you do move outside of your so-called box, be patient and beware. Some people will be uncomfortable with the new you because of their own self-esteem issues. Offer the suggestions and creative ideas anyway. You might end up being labeled differently, and eventually those good ideas will be recognized. The No BS Show is brought to you by Audible.com. Get a free audiobook download and 30-day free trial at audibletrial.com/nobs. Try a book like The Girl with the Lower Back Tattoo by Amy Schumer. You can download it for free today. Go to audibletrial.com/nobs. Again, that's audibletrial.com/nobs for your free audiobook. Over 180,000 titles to choose from for your iPhone, Android, Kindle, or MP3 player. Our guest today is one of Pittsburgh's most influential chefs, Chef Bill Fuller of the Big Burrito Group. Pittsburgh Magazine has named him both Chef of the Year and Restaurateur of the Year, and he's a regular on KDKA's Pittsburgh Today Live. He also has a radio show on WYEP. Many believe Chef Bill and his crew helped establish the dining scene that is now earning Pittsburgh national accolades. So in addition to his work in the kitchen, he's become Pittsburgh's de facto ambassador for fine dining and cooking. Chef Bill, welcome to the show.
Thanks. Nice to be here.
Let's start by having you walk us through your educational background and your career journey.
Yeah, so it's always an interesting question to answer because there's no direct route. Point A to point B often goes through D&E. I hadn't set out to be a chef. I hadn't set out to work in the restaurant industry. It was something I did in high school, and when I finished high school, I spent some time hitchhiking around the country, and so it was easy to work in restaurants to move that along, and I ended up in Washington, D.C., and I went to college at George Mason University, and I was working at a restaurant, a place called the Occidental while I was going to college, and I decided to go back for an economics degree. I figured I'd go a business route and apply, a business education to working in restaurants. And in my first year there, I had to take a science. I'm like, well, I took chemistry in high school, so I'll take chemistry in college, and then I'm good at it. So I switched my major to chemistry and got a undergraduate degree in chemistry at George Mason, and I was finishing up with that degree, and I had to choose what the next step was. And so there are three things you can do with an undergraduate. I could do at that point. I could get a job with a BS in chemistry, which would be working in some testing lab or, doing not very exciting work. I go back to the restaurant business where I was, still was working as a cook, or I go to grad school. And so I was encouraged to apply to grad schools, and I applied. I figured if I'm going to go to grad school, I'm just going to apply to the good ones. And so I got into I got into University of Chicago, I got into Penn, I got into Berkeley, and the University of California, Berkeley has probably the world's best chemistry PhD program. So I went there, and I did that for about 3 years, and I realized that while I love the blackboard, I love the mind experiments in chemistry, I just wasn't in love with it enough to make it my career. And I had some personal things going on. My mom died at that point. I moved back east, back to Pennsylvania, where I'm from, and I ended up back here in Pittsburgh, where I ended up hooking up with these two dudes that had just opened these two Mad Mex restaurants, and I joined them as a cook, sous chef, to open up their third restaurant, which was going to be Kaya, and that was in 1995. And we opened Kaya, and they already, Kaya opened in, I think, end of March, early April, and they already had their eyes on another property in Shadyside. It was a place called Kiku Express, and before that had been a place called the Tender Trap, and that's where we were going to open Casbah, which is going to be Mediterranean. And I said, look, I'm sous chef here at Kaya, but you're going to make me the head chef of that restaurant. And so I opened Casbah with the group, and kind of grew from there. We opened more restaurants. I eventually moved into my corporate chef position, and helped guide this company to have 20 restaurants, 14 Mad Mexes, and 5 others: Kaya, Casbah, Soba 11, and Umi. And here I am today on a podcast.
All kinds of good stuff. Let's go back and touch on a couple of things. Tell me a little bit about the hitchhiking. How long was that, and how many different restaurants do you think you worked at?
So I had some friends in high school that were a year older than me, and they moved to Seattle. And when I finished high school, I said, well, I'll join you. Well, I didn't have any money. I hadn't really been successful saving my money. I'd been a big fan of the Beats, Jack Kerouac, and listening to Bob Dylan or whatever. So I figured I'll just hitchhike. So I loaded up a JCPenney backpack and walked out on the I-80 and stuck my thumb out, and left Falls Creek, Pennsylvania, went west. And I didn't make a straight line. I stopped in Denver for a while, where I didn't actually work in a restaurant. I worked for a while packing books for a book company and doing demolition for a construction company. Then I ended up in Phoenix, then LA, where I had a cousin, and then San Francisco, and then to Seattle, where I worked 2 restaurant jobs in Seattle. I worked as a dishwasher in the morning at the Finney Ridge Omelet House, and I worked as a dishwasher at night at a upscale French restaurant downtown called Mirabeau. And I don't think either of them are still there. But, I was an 18-year-old hippie kid running around, so I was washing dishes all day and night. The best thing about being a dishwasher is you're so necessary that I found I got really well fed. In the daytime, I would get fed by the cooks to help them, keep up with their pots and pans. And at night, in the French restaurant, they would bring us they had baked Alaska. I ate baked Alaska a couple times a week. It was great. So, and then
logistically, being someone that overthinks things, how did you get, when you first start at the place, you're not going to get paid for 2 weeks, or did they pay you under the table daily or weekly or something?
No. Well, I always had some cash. I left with some cash, and then I kind of was running out of money when I got to Denver, so I took those couple of jobs, and I had that money, and then I traveled for a while. When I got to Seattle, I had enough money left, and my friends were already there and had an apartment, so I slept on their couch until I kind of got some cash flow going.
Sure. Okay.
That's an interesting question.
Yeah. I overthink things. I'm well known for it, but I just was picturing that the first, and I've not hitchhiked. So I'm how long were some of the typical hitchhikes? Was one an hour, next one be 4 hours?
Yeah. It's, so the first ride I got was a guy who was driving to Toledo. So, old exit 14, I think it was, that I got on in, middle of Pennsylvania, all the way to Toledo. Then there were some rides where they would take me one exit. There was one time I was hitchhiking, and this car pulls over, and I walk up to it, and there are these 3 girls in the car, like 20 something girls. And I'm in the middle of Iowa, and I'm like, this is great. This is great. So I get in the car, and we're driving down the road, and then, the 3 girls are talking to me, or 3 women are talking to me. And we get halfway to the next exit, and one of them says, so you get any pot? And I said, well, no, I don't. And he pulled over and put me out.
That's beautiful.
I also got a long ride through Iowa with a guy who worked for a seed company. And so we was, and this was in, early summer, and he was just telling me each field, like what variety of corn they were. It was probably the most boring hour and a half of my life. It was so boring, but it was interesting. I met a lot of people, and if my kids did that today, I'd freak out. Although, like now today, kids hitchhiking, I mean, there's cell phones and whatever. I mean, that was when this is in 1985, so you had to use a payphone or write a letter. So.
Yeah. So then, when did you decide to go to George Mason? Did you come back to?
So I came back home, and while I was staying at home, I went to a Grateful Dead show with a friend of mine, and I met this girl who was living in Washington D.C. And she said, "Well, why don't you come down and live with me?" So I did that. And when I got to D.C., I started working in restaurants. And, the relationship with that girl didn't last very long at all, but I stayed in D.C. because it's a pretty cool town. And I was working at a bookstore cafe called Kramer Books and Afterwards in DuPont Circle. And I started to realize that the people around me, it's Washington, D.C., so there are people from all over the world. I think it's one of the most well-educated cities in America, especially in the northwest corner. And or the northwest quadrant, and so I was from Du Bois, Pennsylvania. I realized that I need to further my education. I need to take my next step in the world, because just a high school degree, I was going to work in a restaurant, in a restaurant kitchen the rest of my life, and I wanted to have more options open to me. I was a smart kid. I knew I had more opportunity than that, so I decided to go back to school. And George Mason worked out because it was a state school and it was inexpensive and I could afford it. And like I said, I first went to school thinking, well, I'll just get, an economics degree, maybe go to business school afterwards, see where that goes. And economics is great. One of the frustrating things about the econ classes is, especially early econ, I mean, you have these slopes of these graphs, these demand and, supply and demand curves, and they just move one way or the other. And I would ask my teachers, I would say, but you just you write the curve here and then you write it over there. How do you quantify this? You can't just say the curve shifts. How much does it shift? How do you know how much it shifts? How can you quantify it? And they would say, well, that's not what we do in economics. So it was definitely not hard enough of a science. And I know if I'd have gone further into economic theory, it turns into more mathematical, but it definitely was not concrete enough for my brain. And then, I was taking chemistry as my science course. And I mean, I was always really pretty good at chemistry. And I think chemistry is beautiful. The study of chemistry is awesome. So I stuck with that.
What's great for any listeners that are early in their careers, or we do tend to get some college student listeners just from my teaching and then a lot of the speaking that I do. And if you're a college student and you hear this, here's someone that's hugely successful, in my opinion, and you did your degree because you loved it and you got value from it, but you aren't working in that field. And I mention that to people a lot of times. It's not a disaster if you end up doing something you love that wasn't what you got exactly the education for.
I tell that to people all the time. And the thing about studying chemistry is, chemistry it bridges this barrier between the real world and kind of the imaginary world. I mean, physics and math is really more kind of in the imaginary world, and you apply it a little bit to real world. But chemistry, you have a real world situation where you can do the experiment and see the result, but then you have to figure it out theoretically how it works. And so you get this set of conditions, and you have to take the set of conditions and figure out how they're going to, how much of each reagent to put in the equation, how they're going to react, and how to manipulate the situation so that you get a product. And so the whole study of chemistry and all sciences is taking a set of situations and applying your knowledge and your brain and getting a solution, and then looking at that solution and checking back to see that it makes sense. And that process of working your brain applies to anything you do, whether you're an attorney or whether you're a baker or whether, you build bridges or whether you write novels, it all applies back. And so that was great training. And I think any good education, you learn to solve those problems and then come back and check and make sure your problems are solved. And that applies to whatever you do.
I remember as a kid using the tired old excuse of saying to my dad, why am I doing this algebra? When am I going to use it? And my dad said to me, you'll use it probably most days of your life once you're an adult and working. So now my sons have all said to me, this algebra is stupid. When am I going to ever use it? And I got to repeat what my dad said. But it's true. I think that problem solving you just described, quantitative methods in college was probably the class that I apply the most of now, because you're like an if-then process and scenarios for clients. It's constantly scenarios for clients where we say, well, if this happens, two things could happen. If that happens, two things could happen. Which one do we want to do? So you're applying that every day in the business world.
Right. And, you make decisions and you look at the situation you have and you say, well, what information do I have? What data do I have? What materials do I have? Do I need to get more before I can then move into this decision-making process? And then once you get into the decision-making process, sometimes like you just blow it. It's just shit. And so you got to go back and start with your initial conditions again and say, oh, wait, we did it wrong. It's the same thing, it's the same thing with an experiment in chemistry lab. You start the reagents, you put it in, and it turns into like gray sludge. Well, you failed. Something went wrong. So you go back to your conditions and say, why didn't this work? And what do we need to manipulate to try it again? And so it's, a chemistry experiment and a life experiment. It's all the same. It's more complicated out here than it is in the test tube for sure.
Sure. And that leads me to a question that I was going to ask you that I ask every guest, as I say, talk about a learning experience when maybe you or the BS chef or the BS boss or the BS employee, and tell us what you did, what you learned from it, and how it might help our listeners.
It's funny. I'm going to do a little bit of a lead into the answer to this question. So my current wife, I met, we were working together. She was a waitress bartender at Casbah when we opened, and I was the chef. And she's actually the only person I ever worked with that I dated my whole life. And she was a little bit younger than me. And we were working together, opening the restaurant. We ended up dating. And then, at 8 or 10 months in, she says, you don't know everything you say. And I'm like, what do you mean? She says, well, you say everything you say like it's right and it's right. But sometimes you're just making it up. And I'm like, yeah, that's part of leadership. Like, so often in the restaurant, I know what we want to do, but sometimes I just say, well, this is what we're going to do. And I say it with conviction because you got to lead the people up the hill. And even if you don't know that you're going to make it up the hill, you got to lead them up the hill. So you got to act like you're going to make it up the hill. And she's like, wow. And then, of course, that left me unable to bullshit her then for the next 20 years once she figured that out. But one of the things about one of the problems with the restaurant environment and the restaurant community and the kitchen environment is there's a real sort of like tough guy macho attitude. It's about who can work longer hours, who can drink more, who can smoke more, who can sustain more cuts and burns, who can talk more foul. I mean, it's like it has been historically a real sort of pirate ship mentality, and the toughest survive. One of the interesting things is it's mostly male, watching women develop through the kitchens. Often they have to be more tough, work more hours, talk more coarsely to be accepted. And that's great. However, once they become in leadership positions, often it's more of a handicap for women because, now the foul mouth and the tough guy attitude sometimes hinders them in a leadership position where, it seems like men often are comfortable like letting some of that go and cleaning up their act. And because when you're the boss, you got to clean it up a little bit. But one of the things, and I was a huge proponent of the tough guy mentality, screaming, yelling, working from early in the morning till the middle of the night, just living really hard and working really hard, and then kind of disseminating that through our whole culture. And I think what it led to was a lot of really stressed out, exhausted, worn out people without time to have a life outside of work. And you want your people to be devoted to their work and dedicated to their work. But what isn't good is when you have a stressed out, exhausted person, and the busiest part of the week is Friday and Saturday. And sometimes people are exhausted before the weekend even gets there and they don't have the energy. So one of the big bullshits of, I think, the restaurant business in my career was this, that one has to have that macho, insane environment to succeed. And so over the last 5 years or so, we have really been working to minimize that, to make working in kitchens and working in restaurants actually a livable job. Because there's enough with the tough hours and with customers being rough and with the conditions, there's enough difficulty without that extra level of, you must be a tough guy. You must listen to foul, coarse, angry language. You must work 70, 80 hours a week. I mean, humans can only do so much. So we're really, really trying to make it a much more livable environment. And that was it took me a long time to realize that you don't have to live that way in restaurants. And, we all learned that from who we worked for before. I mean, from the French, the early French brigade system where they, interns were brought in, kids were brought in at like 12, 13, 14 and worked their whole lives and were treated poorly and, forced to work long and insufferable hours. And that system doesn't need to exist to make a restaurant run well. So
does that give you, we'll talk about how that can be a competitive advantage for you, but also how it might have made things difficult when you were trying to shift because some good people that were talented were still in that mindset?
Well, that's an interesting question. I mean, we haven't looked at this change as not being a competitive advantage. I mean, because I still pay people the same or better than market rate, and they're working less with less stress, I hope. And so I hope to retain people more and, encourage people to join our organization. However, there are some people, who think it might just be soft, and they'll say, oh yeah, old Fuller over the Big Burrito, he's gone soft. He's let everybody get soft. And no, it's just being human, and the world has changed. The people's perception in America of how they work. I mean, nobody wants to work in terrible situations or difficult situations. And the kitchen is hot. The hours are at night and on the weekends. You're already separate from society. You do cut and burn yourself. You are under pressure. So why make it worse? Why not make the stuff that doesn't have to be there? Why not make it better? Why not cut the hours down? Or why not, decrease some of the screaming and yelling? Why not make those parts that you can control less onerous? So the suffering, I mean, there's still suffering. You still work, like I said, you still work at night. You're away from normal people. It's hard to see your family. Let's at least make it a nice place to be. So, and I think in the end, the whole climate's going to shift. The whole the macho kitchen restaurant environment's going to shift because it's not productive. And that people have too many options. Mm-hmm. You're not making a couple $100,000 a year to be a chef. I mean, there's other options in the world, and people will take them because all workplaces have become more and more humane. So
agree.
The No BS Marketing Podcast with Dave Mastovich is brought to you by Mass Solutions. Put our 3-step No BS process to work for you. Visit masssolutions.biz today to take your marketing to another level. It's all about bold solutions, no BS.
So talk about, since we're talking about what molded you and what shaped you, and there's good and bad to that with all of us because we get biases based on what we were through in our own life experiences. But I like to hear from leaders like you who, other than their family, are mentors and how they impacted you.
So, my big mentor, my chef mentor, is a guy named Jeffrey Boobin, who has 2 restaurants in Washington, D.C. One is called Vidalia, one is called Bistro Bis. He recently opened a little lunch concept, too. And I worked for him at the Occidental from 1985 to 1992, and I started as a cook and spent 7 years there, working my way through college there. And, Jeff was a tough guy. I mean, I talk about this tough guy chef mentality. He was the king of tough guys. He worked all the time. He would be there Saturday night closing the restaurant, and then I would work Saturday nights and Sunday mornings while I was in school because we had a brunch and I couldn't work as much during the week. And I'd leave work on Saturday night and he'd be there. Then he'd pick me up on the way in from the metro on Sunday morning to go do brunch. I mean, he just worked all the time, and he screamed and yelled and had this this tough guy environment, but. And I learned that from him, and that's a negative. But he was incredibly organized and structured in his habits, and the way the kitchen was organized, and the way the food preparation was organized, and the way the ordering was organized. And so he taught me really this great kitchen organization that everybody doesn't learn. Some kitchens are run willy nilly, but it's got to be organized. He also taught me just dumb things like. You have your order sheet for the produce, and you go through the walk-in and you write down you need 2 cases of lettuce and a case of bananas and 8 bunches of cilantro. And then when you sit on the phone and you call the order in, you circle each item as you order it, so that you've ordered all the things on your sheet. And so the people in the morning, when they look at the sheet before the produce gets there, they know what's coming in. And that seems like a little thing, but I've taught hundreds of people that. People come to work for me from other restaurants and they'll do an order, and I say, "Did you place that order?" They said, "Yeah." I said, "How do I know you placed that order?" Because I did. I said, "Well, when you order, circle the carrot, circle it as you go." And also, kitchens are busy and crazy. So if you're calling in that produce order, and then one of the cooks comes in to tell you that the sauce you had in the stove is boiling over, and you lose track of where you were. If you've circled everything as you go through, you go right back and finish what you're doing. It's a lot of details like that he taught me that I carried forward. And his work ethic. So I mean, he's my big mentor as far as being a chef. And one of the other things, a big lesson I learned was when I first started working for him. The restaurant had a downstairs that was a more casual grill, and upstairs, which was a fine dining room. And he hired me to work this station, the Entremontier station, in the fine dining room. And that was you did all the hot appetizers, and we made all the plates for the saucier who cooked the meat and made the sauces, and the poissonnier who made the fish and did the sauces. And it was a very busy and complex station. I was way over my head. And so I tried to work they trained me the whole first week, and I failed night after night. I couldn't work the station myself. The sous chef would have to come help me. And I went home Friday night, and I'm like, I can't do this. So I came in Saturday, and I said, look, thank you for hiring me, but I can't do this job, so I'm going to have to quit. And he said, well, hold on. We'll move you downstairs to the grill room. And so, and because we'll need somebody down there. So we'll move you down there, and let's see how it goes. And so he could have just said, well, F you, you're not working out, get out of here. But instead he said, here's a resource. Here's a person I've hired and put some effort into. Let's see if I can do something else with them and make it work. So I went down and I started on the fry station and the grill. And then over the course of time, I learned the fry station, I learned the grill station, I learned the salad station. I moved back upstairs and learned all those stations. In the summertime, I would help run the grill room eventually. So by pausing for a minute, and he didn't have to waste any time with me. We hired cooks all the time that would just walk out, or they'd say, get out of here. You're no good. So he didn't have to spend any time, but he had a resource that at least showed up. And I came in to quit. And he said, well, let's look at this resource and let's try to do something else with it and see if it works out. And I was a great employee for him for 7 years. And so, I try to talk to my people about looking at situations and say, and I use that story all the time. Everybody's sick of it. But they say, I have this person who's just not working out. And I say, well, let's reconsider what we can do with this person. Let's try them on a different shift, a different station. Let's try to look at it differently. Or this other situation is not working out, or this dish isn't working out. And I say, let's try to look at this. We've gone this far with this thing, whatever this thing is, and let's look at it and see if we can make an adjustment and keep going with it rather than just throwing it all away and starting again. Because we've invested this time in this person, in this dish, in this process, in this situation. Let's not throw it away.
It's amazing the impact that mentors have and that you're having on people throughout their lives. I have a mentor who, when I was 16 years old, similar story to you. When I was 16 years old, I thought I was going to do radio. So I was passionate about trying to learn radio, and I go and I interview at this radio station. I sent an application in to do whatever they wanted me to do, and the person who was running the station meets me, and the first thing he says is, say WJNL. And I go, WJNL. And he says, no, it's W. And that set the tone with this mentor who, because it's different. It's not W like George W. Bush, it's W. And that attention to detail set the tone from that person who mentored me the whole time that I worked there. And I did something similar to you. He put me on every single shift. I did the midnight to 7 in the morning shift. I wrote news, I wrote sports, but I also did all kinds of what you'd call scut work. Like I can remember setting up for a remote broadcast. Now you're talking back in the 80s when you didn't have the cellular capability, and they had these things called Marty units. And I'm not even sure what it stands for or why it was named that way. Maybe the guy's name was Marty, or it's Marty with a D. But you had to take this big device and you'd plug everything into it, and that's how you connected back to the station so they could broadcast you out. And I can just still remember him sending me and had his checklist, similar to what you said with the produce checklist, for me to be able to go out and set up for the remote broadcast. So those kinds of things, mentors make a big impact on you for life, but also trying all the stuff at any company that you work for molds you.
Yeah, I 100% agree. If you haven't washed dishes, and you can't be a chef. I mean, you got to wash dishes and bust the tables and work all the different stations and really understand the whole organization. And, the people who are successful with me are the people, I might have an event I have to go to, and I'll say, hey, anybody off on Thursday want to come help me with this event? And, the cook who says, hey, I'm off, how about I meet you here at the restaurant? I'll go help you set that event up. that cook, their name, I learned their name then. It's like one of those things. Like we have over 1,000 employees, and part of my job is figuring out who's going to take the next step up to be sous chef or executive chef. And we get this gang of cooks, and I don't know all their names. I mean, it's terrible, but I don't. But once they start to make themselves known by helping out or pitching in or doing something extra, boom, I know your name. And then once your name's well known, and I learned your last name, for God's sake. Like I know Bob and Sam and Joe, but Bob Smith. Oh yeah, Bob Smith, and then you become part of the conversation as to what's going to happen next. And that's always been true and always will be true wherever you work. Like do the extra thing, and you'll get noticed, and you'll learn something in the process. I mean, you'll come out with me to do an event. You're getting noticed, and you're making your intentions known that you want to grow, and then you're going to come in, you're going to learn, you're going to go to an event, and I'm going to say, hey, check it out. All the people are going to come in right away. We're closest to the door, so we're going to get nailed in the beginning, so let's get a bunch of stuff set up. And then once everybody gets in, we're not going to have a lot to do, so then you can go walk around and see the other vendors. Like, you'll learn that. And then one day in your life when you go to an event, you'll know that. Like, so, volunteering and doing the extra scut work, you both get noticed and become more educated.
Hear more of my interview with Chef Bill Fuller on part 2